Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing a deep dive, bringing together neurobiology, sociology, and psychological profiling to uncover the true root causes of violent behavior. We're digging into some deeply fascinating source material that challenges just about everything we think we know about why people commit crimes and, far more importantly, how we can actually stop it. So, let's kick things off with a massive question. Are violent criminals just born that way? Or does society, and maybe trauma, forge them? It's the ultimate nature versus nurture debate, and the answers we've found in recent research are absolutely compelling.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the born criminal myth, see how trauma rewires the brain, and unpack the architecture of violence. Then, we'll step inside a South Indian prison, decode the personality of violence, and finally, look at healing minds and breaking cycles.
Part 1. The born criminal myth.
You know, back in the 19th century, this guy Cesare Lombroso, often called the father of modern criminology, actually believed criminals were biological throwbacks. He literally thought you could spot a violent offender just by looking at the shape of their jaw or an asymmetrical skull. Wild, right? Well, modern science totally rejects this biological determinism. Today, we know for sure that environmental factors, things like early trauma, poverty, family instability, and negative peer groups, those are the true architects of deviant behavior.
Which brings us to Section 2, how trauma actually rewires brains. To really grasp the biology here, we have to talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, like abuse or deep neglect. Our source material shows that these childhood traumas aren't just bad emotional memories. They literally act as a physical force on a developing brain. Chronic stress during childhood disrupts the normal development of the brain's emotional and cognitive centers, permanently altering how someone processes the world around them as an adult.
Think of the brain kind of like a car. The amygdala is our alarm bell. It detects threats, and the prefrontal cortex is the brakes, handling our impulse control. Well, chronic trauma totally throws this out of whack. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, so a traumatized person might perceive danger and lash out even when they're in a perfectly safe situation. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part that stops us from acting on every single impulse, literally shrinks and gets weaker. The alarm is constantly blaring, and the brakes are basically broken.
Okay, let's zoom out to Section 3, the architecture of violence.
Looking at the sociological data, it's pretty staggering. Surveys show that 42% of men and 52% of women in India actually believe a husband is justified in beating his wife. It's a reflection of some deeply absorbed norms. According to the gender studies research we're unpacking, these justifications are often for things as routine as stepping out of the house without telling the husband or not cooking a meal properly. So what's the takeaway here? Violence isn't always seen as a crime by the community. It's frequently viewed as a totally acceptable corrective measure.
These normalized, systemic patriarchal structures actually weaponize vulnerabilities. They trap individuals in abusive situations under the guise of izzat, which translates to family honor. Our sources highlight that in these collectivist structures, reporting abuse is often reframed not as an act of self-protection, but as a total betrayal of the family. It creates this vicious environment where violence isn't just an isolated incident of someone losing their temper, it's a predictable output of a system designed to enforce strict social roles.
Let's ground this in a real-world case study. Section 4, inside a South Indian prison. To see how all these theories play out in reality, let's dive into a fascinating 2025 study from the Journal of Medical Sciences. Researchers looked at 60 convicted prisoners in Cuddalore, Tamil Nadu. It's a really great step away from typical Western-centric data aimed at profiling the specific socio-demographic and psychological risks of this exact population. And honestly, what they found is incredibly counterintuitive.
Get ready for a massive surprise. A staggering 92.5% of these violent offenders had absolutely no prior incarcerations. Just think about that for a second. We almost always assume violent crime is committed by career criminals, people in and out of the system their whole lives. But for the vast majority of these individuals, a severe crime like murder was their very first time in prison. It strongly points to a sudden escalation or a high-stress environment that just pushed them over the edge rather than a lifelong pattern of breaking the law.
And the surprises definitely don't stop there. When we look at education, while nearly half of the violent offenders were unskilled workers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, a full 34% held university degrees. Compare that to the nonviolent group in the study, who had 0 university degrees but were entirely made up of semi-skilled or skilled workers with 0 unemployment. This absolutely shatters the stereotype that violent crime is just a product of a lack of education. It points us toward much deeper psychological vulnerabilities.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, the personality of violence.
So, if a solid education and a clean record don't stop someone from committing violence, what actually drives it? Well, psychological profiling using the NEO-FFI3 inventory reveals a dangerously potent combination. High neuroticism means these folks are super susceptible to stress and emotional instability. Low extroversion points to social isolation. But the real powder keg, it's the other two traits. Over 80% showed extremely low agreeableness, meaning a profound lack of empathy, trust, and cooperation. And over 90% had extremely low conscientiousness, which shows up as impulsivity and a total inability to foresee consequences. Throw in a high-stress environment or some childhood trauma, and this personality profile is essentially primed to explode.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Healing Minds, Breaking Cycles.
Fortunately, science doesn't just map out the damage, it actually gives us a way out. Drawing from research in the International Journal of Indian Psychology, we find a real message of hope here. This source beautifully bridges the gap between modern clinical therapies and ancient philosophical traditions to offer a totally holistic approach to healing a traumatized brain.
There is this amazing overlap happening between two very different worlds. Modern science calls it neuroplasticity. That's the brain's physical ability to form new neural connections and actually strengthen a damaged prefrontal cortex through things like cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. Ancient Indian philosophy calls it samskara, the understanding that psychological impressions can be completely molded and reformed through discipline, meditation, and a healthy community environment. They're just two different languages describing the exact same human capacity for profound change.
As the text defines it, samskara is a process by which good qualities are imparted and defects removed. By integrating holistic practices like yoga alongside clinical therapy, we aren't just punishing an individual. We're actively lowering their cortisol levels, calming down that hyperactive amygdala, and rebuilding the brain's emotional brakes. We're actually treating the root cause of the violent behavior, rather than just locking up the symptom.
So, we're going to wrap up this explainer by asking you to completely rethink justice. Based on everything we've just learned about brain chemistry, societal pressures, and the incredible potential for neuroplastic healing, how can society move from mere punishment to actual systemic rehabilitation? If violence is a tragic combination of a rewired brain and a permissive culture, then true justice absolutely has to involve healing that brain and changing that culture. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the science and sociology of violence. Keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you in the next explainer.